You have been told the story of the Council of Nicaea. You have heard the tales of political maneuvering, of the Roman Emperor Constantine's calculated grasp for power, of the systematic removal of books from the biblical canon. It is a compelling story of intrigue and imperial manipulation, a story that rightly makes us question the sanitized version of church history we were given. But that story, as shocking as it is only the outer layer of the truth. It is the story they want you to focus on, a distraction that keeps your eyes fixed on the political stage while the true cosmic drama unfolds in the shadows. The real secret of Nicaea is not that they banned certain books. The real secret is why they banned them. The decision was not just a political one, it was a spiritual one. They were not just trying to consolidate an empire, they were trying to contain a universe. Today, we peel back the political explanation to reveal the theological terror that lay beneath it. The question is not who banned the Book of Enoch. The question that should haunt you, the question that we will answer today, is this: what was written in the pages of that forbidden book that so terrified the most powerful empire on earth that they had to erase it from history? Because the answer to that question reveals that they were not just hiding books. They were hiding a war. Before we unseal the contents of this forbidden book, we must first confront the lie that has been used for centuries to justify its exclusion. The gatekeepers of later tradition would have you believe that the Book of Enoch was a fringe text, a piece of wild, mystical fantasy that was never taken seriously by the early believers. This is a deliberate and calculated falsehood. The historical record tells a very different story. The Book of Enoch was not banned because it was unreliable. It was banned precisely because its authority was so ancient and so powerful that it posed a direct threat to the simplified version of Christianity that the empire sought to create. Let us be clear. For the Jewish communities in the centuries leading up to Christ, the Book of Enoch was not just an important book. For many, it was scripture. When archaeologists unearthed the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, they found numerous copies of Enoch, preserved with the same care and reverence as the books of Isaiah or the Psalms. The Qumran community, a devout and ascetic sect, did not see Enoch as fiction. They saw it as prophecy, a divine revelation that explained the very origins of evil and the coming of the final judgment. This reverence was not confined to ascetic desert communities. The authority of Enoch echoed directly into the New Testament itself. In the short, powerful letter of Jude, a book that did make it into our canon, the author does something astonishing. He quotes the Book of Enoch directly, citing it as an authentic prophecy. Jude writes, "It was also about these that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, 'Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all.'" Jude is not quoting a folk tale. He is quoting a sacred text, treating Enoch not as a myth, but as a true prophet of God. Even the earliest church fathers, the very men whose writings would shape Christian doctrine for centuries, wrestled with the power of Enoch's testimony. Figures like Tertullian, Justin Martyr, and Origen all reference the book, accepting its account of the fallen angels as a foundational part of the Christian understanding of the spiritual world. It was only later, as the church became more institutionalized, more political, and more aligned with the Roman state, that the book began to be seen as a problem. It did not become less true, it simply became more inconvenient. It did not lack authority. Its authority was simply too ancient, too wild, and too independent to be controlled by the new centralized power structure of imperial Christianity. So they did not refute it. They simply silenced it. The moment you open the pages of the Book of Enoch, you realize why it had to be suppressed. The universe it describes is not the tidy, almost empty cosmos of later, simplified theology. The world we are taught about is often a three-tiered structure: heaven above, earth in the middle, and hell below, with a cast of characters largely limited to God, angels, demons, and humanity. It is a simple stage for a simple moral play. But the universe of Enoch is a sprawling, complex, and terrifyingly alive cosmic blueprint, a multidimensional reality teeming with hierarchies of spiritual beings, celestial laws, and cosmic machinery that would make an imperial administrator shudder. Enoch does not speak of a vague, singular heaven. He is taken on a journey, as we have seen, through multiple heavens, each with its own specific function, its own angelic governors, and its own secrets. He describes the storehouses of the snow and the hail, the treasuries of the winds, and the celestial portals through which the sun and moon pass on their divinely appointed circuits. This is not poetry, it is physics. It is a vision of a universe that runs not on random chance, but on a set of intricate and unchangeable laws, all governed by legions of celestial beings. He describes a throne room of God, surrounded not by a generic chorus of angels, but by specific, named classes of beings. There are the archangels, Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, Uriel, who act as the high commanders of the heavenly host. There are the cherubim, the seraphim, and the ophanim, the fiery, many-eyed wheels that transport the very glory of God. He speaks of angels who govern the seasons, angels who guide the stars, and angels who record every deed and word of mankind. For a political operator like Constantine, whose entire project depended on creating a simple, unified, and easily controllable state religion, this worldview was an administrative nightmare. How could you possibly package this sprawling, mystical cosmology for the masses? How could you build a rigid, hierarchical church on a theological foundation that was so filled with mystery, so populated by powerful and autonomous spiritual beings? The God of Enoch was not a distant philosophical concept that could be neatly defined in a creed. He was the commander of a vast and complex cosmic government, a reality far too big to fit inside the walls of a Roman basilica. The first truth that had to be suppressed was the sheer scale and complexity of the universe itself. Within this complex and teeming cosmos, the Book of Enoch reveals the central, explosive truth that the gatekeepers of Nicaea could not afford to let stand. It is a truth that fundamentally alters the entire narrative of sin and evil. Genesis gives us a few cryptic verses about sons of God taking daughters of men. It is a brief, almost whispered account of a strange transgression. But Enoch takes this whispered secret and turns it into a full-throated war cry. It tells the forbidden story of a heavenly mutiny. According to the detailed chronicle in Enoch, this was not a random or isolated act of angelic lust. It was a planned, coordinated, and conspiratorial rebellion. A specific class of angels, 200 of them, known as the Watchers, were stationed in the heavens with a sacred duty to watch over the fledgling human race. But their guardianship curdled into desire. Led by a high-ranking angel named Samyaza, they looked down upon the daughters of men and they coveted them. This was not a momentary weakness, it was a calculated decision. Enoch records the chilling moment of their conspiracy. They gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon, a place that would forever be associated with this cosmic treason. And there, they bound themselves together with a terrible oath, a mutual curse, swearing that none of them would turn back from their intended plan. They would descend together, they would take human wives, and they would defile themselves with mortal flesh. This act was not just a sin, it was a breach of cosmic law, a violation of the sacred boundary between the celestial and terrestrial realms. But more than that, it was an act of mutiny. These were not demons from the pit rising up in rebellion. These were members of God's own heavenly host, his appointed guardians, turning against their own king and their sacred commission. This is the first truth that Constantine's simplified Christianity could not tolerate. It proves that instability, rebellion, and profound moral failure are not just problems of the earthly realm. It reveals a fracture, a schism within the very ranks of heaven itself. For an emperor trying to build a religion of absolute order and unquestionable divine authority, the story of a mutiny in heaven was an intolerable piece of evidence. It suggested that the forces of God were not perfectly unified, that even those who had stood in the light could choose the darkness. This was not a story that supported the image of a stable, all-powerful, and perfectly ordered celestial government. It was the story of a civil war, and it had to be suppressed. The mutiny of the Watchers was not merely a crime of passion or rebellion, it was an act of cosmic espionage. They did not descend to Earth empty-handed. In their betrayal, they carried with them the secrets of heaven, a transfer of forbidden knowledge so potent that it would fundamentally alter the course of human history and accelerate the world's plunge into chaos. Genesis remains silent on this, leaving us to wonder what made the pre-flood world so wicked. But the Book of Enoch provides a detailed and terrifying inventory of the contraband. This was not simply a case of teaching humanity how to read the stars or build better fires. This was a deliberate leaking of what can only be described as divine technology, skills, and arts that were never meant for mortal hands without the guidance and timing of the Creator. The text lists the specific angels and the secrets they revealed. 1. Azazel taught men the art of metallurgy, the forging of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. In a single act, he transformed a world of simple agriculture into a world of organized warfare. He also taught the art of cosmetics, the making of bracelets, the use of antimony to beautify the eyelids, the dyeing of fabrics, not as tools of beauty, but as instruments of seduction and vanity. Another watcher taught the secrets of sorcery, the cutting of roots, and the incantations that could bind spirits. Another revealed the signs of the heavens, not for the purpose of marking God's sacred seasons, but for the practice of astrology, a way to divine the future and usurp the sovereignty of God. Another taught the knowledge of the clouds, the signs of the earth, and the courses of the sun, turning sacred science into a tool for manipulation. This transfer of knowledge was a catastrophic disruption of the divine plan. It was like giving the blueprints for a nuclear reactor to a tribe that had just discovered fire. The Watchers gifted humanity with power without the wisdom to wield it, with technology without the theology to guide it. This act transformed humanity from a race of simple, dependent worshippers into a race of aspiring sorcerers, warriors, and masters of their own destiny. It was this injection of forbidden knowledge, this premature and corrupting technological leap, that truly defined the wickedness of the pre-flood age. It was a world that had climbed too high, too fast, using a ladder that had been stolen from heaven. And for an emperor like Constantine, whose power depended on controlling the flow of information and maintaining a clear hierarchy between the divine and the mortal, the story of this forbidden transfer of power was an existential threat. It suggested that the boundaries of knowledge were permeable and that humanity's greatest sins were not born of ignorance, but of a knowledge they were never meant to possess. The forbidden union between the rebellious Watchers and human women, combined with the injection of celestial technology, produced a result so monstrous that it would necessitate the complete cleansing of the planet. This was not just a moral or spiritual corruption, it was a biological one. From these unholy unions, a new race was born, the Nephilim. The Book of Genesis mentions them in a single cryptic verse, calling them mighty men who were of old, men of renown. But this sanitized description belies the true horror of their existence, a horror that the Book of Enoch describes with unflinching detail. The Nephilim were not just large humans, they were giants, hybrid beings of immense stature and supernatural strength, but their physical size was the least of their terrors. They were born with an insatiable predatory hunger that the natural world could not satisfy. Enoch's chronicle is a grim report of their systematic destruction of the created order. At first, they consumed all the acquisitions of men, the crops, the livestock, the stored grains. When that was not enough, they began to devour mankind itself. And when there were no more humans to consume, they turned on one another, drinking blood and eating flesh in a cannibalistic frenzy. They were a biological plague, a genetic cancer that was literally eating the world alive. This is the second great truth that Constantine's imperial Christianity could not tolerate. It reframes the Great Flood not as a simple punishment for human wickedness, but as a desperate and necessary act of cosmic surgery. God did not flood the world because people were being immoral. He flooded the world to execute a genetic cleansing, to excise a rampant hybrid malignancy that was corrupting the human genome itself and threatening to erase the line of Adam completely. The Nephilim were an abomination, a dead-end branch of creation that could not be allowed to continue. The Ark was not just a lifeboat for a righteous family, it was a genetic preserve, a vessel designed to carry the pure, uncorrupted seed of humanity through the waters of destruction. For an emperor seeking to build a unified, predictable religion, this story was anathema. It introduced the terrifying concept of spiritual and genetic contamination, of a conflict that was not just about belief, but about bloodlines. It presented a God who was forced to act not just as a moral judge, but as a divine surgeon, cutting out a cancerous growth to save the patient. This was a truth far too raw, too biological, and too terrifying for the polished, philosophical Christianity of the Nicene councils. The story of the Nephilim had to be reduced to a myth, its true, horrifying nature buried beneath the rising waters of a simplified theology. As if the revelation of a celestial mutiny and a race of flesh-eating giants were not enough, the Book of Enoch presented another profound threat to the controlled hierarchical religion that Constantine sought to build. It did not just reveal a secret history of the earth, it provided a detailed eyewitness map of the heavens themselves. The journey of Enoch, as recounted in the second Book of Enoch, is not a vague mystical ascent. It is a guided tour through a complex, multi-layered cosmos, a reality that dwarfed the simple heaven and hell dichotomy of later theology. Enoch is taken by angels through 10 distinct heavens, each with its own population, its own function, and its own secrets. In the first heaven, he sees the celestial storehouses of snow and the rulers of the stars. In the second, he beholds the prison of the fallen angels, a place of darkness and unending grief. In the third, he witnesses 2 separate realms, the breathtaking beauty of the Garden of Eden, prepared for the righteous, and a terrifying place of fire and ice reserved for the wicked, a vision of paradise and torment existing in the same celestial dimension. As he ascends, the complexity grows. He sees the intricate workings of the sun and moon in the fourth heaven, the silent, grieving Grigori, a class of watchers, in the fifth, and the 7 bands of archangels who record the lives of all men in the sixth. Finally, he approaches the throne of God itself in the 7th heaven, surrounded by legions of cherubim and seraphim. This is not a simple, singular destination. It is a vast, intricate and living bureaucracy, a cosmic government of staggering complexity. For an emperor like Constantine, and for the bishops who sought to build a single, unified church on earth, this map of the heavens was an administrative and theological nightmare. How could a terrestrial church, with its rigid hierarchy of deacons, priests and bishops, claim to be the sole authority on divine matters when the heavens themselves were so complex and populated by countless orders of powerful beings with their own specific duties? An organized religion requires a simple heaven and a simple hell, a clear path and a clear set of rules that the institution can administer. Enoch's vision presented a cosmos that was wild, mystical, and ultimately beyond the control of any earthly institution. It suggested that there were realms, secrets, and spiritual realities that no council of bishops could ever hope to fully define or govern. It was a map that revealed just how small the earthly church was in the grand scheme of a multi-layered universe. For a system built on claiming to hold the exclusive keys to the kingdom, this detailed and uncontrollable celestial geography was a truth that could not be allowed to stand. It had to be simplified, its details forgotten, and its map rolled up and hidden away. Perhaps the most direct and politically dangerous aspect of the Book of Enoch was not its history of the past, but its prophecies for the future. The book does not end with Enoch's tour of the heavens. It culminates in a series of vivid, unsparing visions of the final judgment. And this was not a vague, philosophical end-times scenario. It was a detailed, military-style prophecy that spoke of a coming cosmic war, a divine intervention that would bypass all earthly authorities, including emperors. This is the very prophecy that the Apostle Jude saw fit to quote in the New Testament. Enoch prophesied, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all." This is the language of a conquering king returning with his celestial army. Enoch's visions describe this event with terrifying clarity. He sees the final judgment of the imprisoned watchers who are brought forth from their abyss to face their eternal sentence. He sees the destruction of the wicked and the unrighteous on earth, and he sees the establishment of a new, righteous kingdom under the direct rule of a figure he calls the Son of Man, the elect one, who will sit upon a throne of glory. For an emperor like Constantine, who had just positioned himself as God's chosen representative on earth, the divinely ordained unifier of both church and state, these prophecies were a direct threat. The Book of Enoch presented a vision of the end times that had no room for a Roman emperor. The final decisive act of history was not to be a political consolidation under a Christian ruler, but a supernatural invasion by a divine king and his angelic armies. This eschatology was profoundly counter-imperial. It taught believers to place their ultimate hope not in the stability of the Roman peace, but in a future, catastrophic intervention from heaven. It fostered a mindset of spiritual vigilance and detachment from the political powers of the age, reminding the faithful that the current world system, even a supposedly Christianized one, was temporary and ultimately destined for judgment. Constantine needed a Christianity that supported his vision of a long and prosperous Christian empire. He needed a theology that saw his reign as a fulfillment of prophecy, not as a temporary placeholder awaiting a divine overthrow. The Book of Enoch, with its vivid prophecies of a coming heavenly king and a final apocalyptic war, was the very antithesis of this imperial theology. It was a revolutionary text, a manifesto for a kingdom that was not of this world. And for an emperor who was trying to merge the kingdom of God with the kingdom of Rome, it was a narrative that had to be silenced, its prophecies forgotten, and its author relegated to the margins of a forgotten history. So we must now ask the central question of our investigation. After examining the explosive contents of this forbidden book, why did the empire, under the guidance of Constantine, truly fear it? What was the fundamental threat that necessitated its removal from the official Christian consciousness? The first and most profound threat was to the very character of God that imperial Christianity sought to promote. The project at Nicaea and in the councils that followed was one of simplification and definition. The goal was to create a God who was comprehensible, predictable, and whose nature could be neatly encapsulated in a creed. They debated the abstract philosophical substance of the Son, the procession of the Spirit, the singular essence of the Godhead. The result was the Trinity, a powerful and profound doctrine, but one that presented God in a clean, almost mathematical formula. One essence, three persons. It was a God who could be defended with logic, a God who could be the stable, unchanging foundation for a stable, unchanging empire. But the God revealed in the Book of Enoch is not simple. He is not a neat formula. He is a terrifying sovereign king presiding over a vast and complex cosmic government. The universe of Enoch is not a quiet, empty space where a philosophical trinity contemplates itself. It is a bustling and at times chaotic reality filled with legions of angels, multiple heavens, celestial prisons, and ongoing spiritual warfare. This worldview did not fit the clean, Hellenistic philosophical model of God that the Nicene Fathers were trying to build. The God of Enoch was a God of armies, a God who permitted mutinies within his own ranks, a God who sanctioned the genetic cleansing of a planet. This was not a God that could be easily packaged for public consumption. This was not a God who fit neatly into the rational, orderly worldview of the Roman elite. He was too wild, too sovereign, too mysterious. The world of Enoch could not be summarized in a pithy sermon or a simple creed. To accept Enoch was to accept a universe that was far more complex, and a God who was far less controllable than the imperial system could tolerate. The first casualty of the Nicene project was not a book. It was the staggering and untamable complexity of the divine reality itself. The second great threat posed by the Book of Enoch was its radical and deeply unsettling explanation for the origin of evil on earth. The narrative that imperial Christianity was beginning to construct was a profoundly human-centric one. It placed the blame for the world's brokenness squarely on the shoulders of humanity. The story was simple and powerful. God created a perfect world, and then Adam and Eve, through a single act of free will disobedience, introduced sin and death into creation. This is a theologically efficient narrative. It creates a clear problem, human sin, and a clear line of accountability. It also creates a system where human guilt becomes a primary tool of social and religious control. A state religion, as Constantine understood, needs a population that can be managed through a shared sense of moral culpability. If humanity is the sole author of its own misery, then the solutions offered by the Church and the state become not just helpful, but necessary. But the Book of Enoch shatters this simple, human-centric model. It does not absolve humanity of its sin, but it places that sin within a much larger and more terrifying context. It reveals that before Adam's fall, there was another, more catastrophic fall. It tells a story where evil was not born from a human choice, but was actively imported into the world through a heavenly invasion. The Watchers did not just tempt humanity. They taught, they corrupted, and they contaminated humanity, both spiritually and genetically. In this worldview, humanity is not just a perpetrator of sin, it is also a victim of a cosmic assault. Our fall was not the first act of the drama. It was a subsequent tragedy in a war that had already begun. This profoundly complicates the problem of evil. It suggests that the forces of darkness we struggle against are not just the echoes of our own bad choices, but are ancient, intelligent, and non-human entities who have been waging war against God's creation since the beginning. For a religion seeking to establish a clear and simple system of guilt and absolution, this was an intolerable complexity. It was far easier to blame a woman and a piece of fruit than it was to explain a mutiny of 200 angels and a race of flesh-eating giants. The gatekeepers of Nicaea needed a story where humanity was the sole problem, because that made their institution the sole solution. The Book of Enoch, by revealing that we were born onto a battlefield and were victims as well as villains, presented a truth that was too messy, too complex, and ultimately too compassionate for a system that was being built on the foundation of human guilt. The third and most dangerous threat that the Book of Enoch posed, the one that almost certainly sealed its fate in the eyes of the emperor, was its direct and uncompromising challenge to imperial authority itself. Constantine's entire project was built on a new and revolutionary idea, the fusion of the Roman Empire with the Christian Church. He was not just an emperor who happened to be a Christian. He positioned himself as God's chosen regent on earth, a 13th apostle, a figure whose political authority was divinely ordained and whose will was synonymous with the will of God. The stability of his empire depended on the unquestioning acceptance of this new, sacred political order. But the Book of Enoch presents a worldview where the ultimate authority in the universe lies entirely outside the reach of any earthly king or emperor. The book is saturated with a profound and almost anarchic sense of celestial sovereignty. It speaks of heavenly laws that govern all of creation, of cosmic decrees written on unalterable tablets, and of a final judgment that will be executed not by a Roman emperor, but by the Son of Man returning with an army of 10,000 angels. This is a profoundly anti-imperial theology. It teaches believers that their ultimate allegiance is not to the throne in Constantinople, but to the throne in the seventh heaven. It reminds them that earthly empires are temporary, fragile, and ultimately subject to the judgment of a higher king. The prophecies of Enoch do not envision a future where a Christianized Roman Empire ushers in an era of peace. They envision a future where that very empire, along with all other earthly powers, will be swept away in a final apocalyptic war. For an emperor like Constantine, whose entire political legacy was predicated on the idea that he was building an eternal Christian kingdom on earth, this was sedition dressed up as scripture. It was a revolutionary text that implicitly questioned his own legitimacy. A book that teaches its readers that a divine king is coming with an army to overthrow the existing world order is not a book that a sitting emperor wants circulating among his subjects. The Book of Enoch, therefore, had to be removed not just because its theology was complex or its history was disturbing, but because its political implications were revolutionary. It presented a model of divine authority that was absolute and a vision of the future that was apocalyptic. It was a direct threat to the very foundation of the new Christian Roman Empire. And for that crime, for the crime of placing God's authority above the emperor's, it was condemned to be forgotten. The condemnation of the Book of Enoch was not a single dramatic event. There was no grand council where its pages were publicly burned. The act of erasure was far more subtle, more patient, and ultimately more effective. It was a systematic campaign of silencing, a slow and deliberate process of transforming a revered book of prophecy into a piece of dangerous and heretical superstition. The process likely began in the very scriptoriums commissioned by Constantine himself. When the emperor ordered the production of 50 standardized Bibles for the new churches of Constantinople, the Book of Enoch was simply left out. There was no announcement, no public debate. It vanished from the official collection through a quiet act of omission. And once it was removed from the officially sanctioned Bibles, the process of forgetting began to accelerate. In the generations that followed Nicaea, the Church Fathers, now operating within this new, imperially approved framework, began to speak of Enoch with increasing suspicion. Where earlier writers like Tertullian had defended its prophetic authority, later figures like Augustine and Jerome began to question its authenticity. They pointed to its wild cosmology and its detailed stories of fallen angels as evidence that it could not be divinely inspired. They argued that it was a product of Jewish fantasy, a fable that distracted from the more sober and philosophical truths of the now orthodox faith. The book was not refuted with evidence. It was dismissed with condescension. It was slowly pushed from the center of Christian thought to the margins. It was no longer read in most church services. It was no longer used as a source for theological argument. It was relegated to the shadowy realm of apocrypha, a scholarly term that sounds neutral, but in practice often means a truth too inconvenient to be considered canonical. The final step in this process of erasure was to transform its reputation. The book that had once been quoted by the apostles as prophecy was now branded as heresy. Its teachings about the Watchers were reinterpreted as a dangerous myth that threatened the doctrine of a purely human-centric fall. Its complex cosmology was labeled as Gnostic-like speculation. Over the course of a few centuries, the gatekeepers of the new orthodoxy successfully took one of the most foundational texts of early Jewish and Christian thought and turned it into a piece of forbidden literature. They did not destroy the book, they destroyed its character. And in doing so, they ensured that for the next 1500 years, the vast majority of Christians would never even know what they had lost. The decision by Constantine and the later church councils to ban the Book of Enoch did not end the cosmic war. It simply removed the battle map from the hands of the soldiers. For nearly 17 centuries, Western Christianity has operated with a profound and crippling strategic disadvantage. We have been taught to fight a spiritual battle without a complete understanding of the enemy, his origins, his strategies, or the true scale of the conflict. By erasing the story of the Watchers, the gatekeepers left us with a vague and abstract concept of Satan or demons, often reducing them to mere symbols of internal temptation. But the Book of Enoch provides a detailed military intelligence report. It tells us that our enemy is not just a singular fallen archangel, but a complex hierarchy of rebellious beings with specific names, specific roles, and a specific history of interaction with our world. It reveals that the demonic forces we contend with are not just abstract spirits, but are the disembodied, tormented souls of their giant, hybrid offspring, the Nephilim. This knowledge is not trivial. It is a field manual for spiritual warfare. It explains the enemy's deep-seated hatred for humanity, a hatred born from their own illegitimate origins. It explains their terrestrial focus, their relentless desire to corrupt, torment, and destroy human beings, because humanity represents the world they can never fully possess. To know this is to move from a defensive crouch to an informed, strategic posture. Without this cosmic context, much of modern Christianity has become spiritually naive. We are often ill-equipped to recognize the more sophisticated strategies of the enemy. We see political turmoil, cultural decay, and technological seduction as purely human problems, failing to recognize the ancient supernatural patterns that lie beneath them. We fight battles on the surface, unaware of the deeper, celestial war that is raging for the soul of our planet. The banning of Enoch was not just an act of historical censorship, it was an act of strategic disarmament. And we have been fighting with one hand tied behind our backs ever since. To rediscover the Book of Enoch is to be handed a key, a cipher that unlocks the cryptic and often misunderstood passages within our canonical Bible. Suddenly, verses that once seemed strange, allegorical, or out of place are revealed to be direct references to this suppressed cosmic history. The New Testament, it turns out, is not silent about the events described in Enoch. We have simply been taught not to hear the echoes. Consider the words of the Apostle Peter. In his second epistle, he issues a stark warning about God's judgment, and to prove his point, he reaches back to a pre-Adamic event. He writes, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness, to be kept until the judgment." Where in the canonical Old Testament is this story told in such detail? It isn't. Peter is directly referencing the well-known story from the Book of Enoch, the imprisonment of the Watchers in the second heaven. For Peter and his first-century audience, Enoch was not a forbidden book. It was the essential backstory needed to understand the scope of divine justice. The Apostle Jude, as we have seen, does the same, not only referencing the story, but quoting Enoch's prophecy directly. But the echoes are everywhere. When Jesus speaks of the end of the age being as it was in the days of Noah, he is not just talking about people eating and drinking. He is invoking the entire terrible context of that era, the coming of the Watchers, the corruption of all flesh, and the birth of the Nephilim. His audience, steeped in this literature, would have understood the chilling depth of his warning. He was not predicting a moral decline, he was predicting a supernatural incursion. Even the Apostle Paul's writings are illuminated. When he speaks of principalities, powers, and spiritual wickedness in high places, he is not using vague poetic language. He is referring to the complex angelic hierarchies and the rebellious cosmic government that Enoch describes in detail. When he warns the Corinthian women to cover their heads because of the angels, many scholars believe he is making a direct allusion to the Watchers, who were first drawn to sin by the sight of uncovered human women. By restoring the Book of Enoch to its rightful place as the foundational context for the New Testament world, we begin to see the Bible in its true three-dimensional reality. The apostles were not operating in a theological vacuum. They were living, breathing, and writing within a universe whose history and cosmology had been profoundly shaped by the truths that Enoch recorded. We have not been given a different Bible. We have simply been given back the lens through which it was always meant to be read. The worldview presented in the Book of Enoch is not a comfortable one. It does not offer a gentle, pastoral faith designed for quiet contemplation in a safe and predictable world. It offers something far more demanding, far more urgent, and ultimately far more realistic. The faith that emerges from the pages of Enoch is a faith for soldiers, not for civilians. It is a faith that understands it was born on a battlefield, that it lives in occupied territory, and that its primary posture must be one of constant strategic vigilance. The Christianity that developed in the wake of Constantine's censorship is, in many ways, a civilian faith. It is a religion of comfort, of personal improvement, of seeking peace and prosperity within the existing systems of the world. It often treats the spiritual battle as a metaphor for internal psychological struggles. Its goal is often to create a safe, welcoming space, a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the world. But the faith of Enoch is a faith of the front lines. It understands that the harsh realities of the world are not just human problems. They are the physical manifestations of an ancient, ongoing cosmic war. It does not seek comfort, it seeks readiness. It does not seek a sanctuary, it seeks to be an outpost, a fortified position in enemy territory. This worldview changes everything. Prayer is no longer just a quiet time of personal reflection. It is a strategic act of wartime communication. Studying Scripture is not just for intellectual or moral improvement. It is the act of studying the battle map and the enemy's dossier. Fellowship with other believers is not just a social gathering. It is the rallying of a military unit, a gathering of soldiers to share intelligence, tend to their wounds, and prepare for the next engagement. This is a faith that is not easily institutionalized. It does not fit neatly into building programs, weekly sermons, or denominational hierarchies. It is a rugged, resilient, and deeply discerning faith, one that is always aware of the unseen conflict that rages beneath the surface of everyday life. This is precisely why Constantine's imperial system could not tolerate it. An empire needs civilians, content and compliant subjects who trust the state to protect them. The last thing an emperor wants is a population of spiritual soldiers who believe their ultimate allegiance is to a coming celestial king and who see the present world system as a temporary, fallen structure awaiting a divine overthrow. The Book of Enoch does not call us to a comfortable religion. It calls us to enlist in a cosmic war. For nearly 1700 years, the Book of Enoch and the cosmic worldview it contained remained largely buried, a secret kept by a few scattered and often persecuted communities. The powerful machinery of imperial Christianity, both in its Roman Catholic and later Protestant forms, had been overwhelmingly successful. The silence was almost absolute, but a truth that is divinely ordained cannot be silenced forever. And the re-emergence of this forbidden knowledge in our own time is not an academic accident. It is a prophetic event of the highest order. The first tremor of this awakening came in the 18th century, when the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia with the first complete manuscripts of the Book of Enoch that the Western world had seen in over 1,000 years. At first, it was treated as a bizarre curiosity, a piece of exotic mystical literature. Scholars debated its origins, dismissed its contents as fantasy, and relegated it to the footnotes of theological history. The gatekeepers of tradition, secure in their centuries of control, did not see it as a threat. But then came the second and far more powerful earthquake. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost goat in the cliffs above the Dead Sea stumbled upon a series of hidden caves. Inside, preserved in clay jars for 2 millennia, was the lost library of the Qumran community. And among those scrolls, confirming the authenticity of the Ethiopian texts, were multiple ancient fragments of the Book of Enoch. This was a discovery that could not be dismissed. It was tangible, archaeological proof that this book was not some later invention, but was a foundational text for a devout Jewish community living and breathing in the very world of Jesus and the apostles. Suddenly, the forbidden history was no longer a distant whisper from a forgotten African church. It was a loud, clear voice, speaking to us directly from the dust of the first century. Why now? Why is this knowledge, so long and so successfully suppressed, resurfacing with such force in our specific generation? The answer, from a prophetic perspective, is clear. We are living in a time that increasingly mirrors the very conditions that Enoch described in the days before the flood. We are witnessing an explosion of forbidden knowledge, a blurring of the boundaries between the human and the artificial, and a rise of powerful, godlike figures who demand our worship. The very battles that Enoch chronicled are beginning to be fought again, and in his mercy, God is unsealing the ancient records, returning the battle map to his people, so that we might understand the times we are living in and not be deceived by the coming storm. The return of the Book of Enoch is not for the sake of historical curiosity, it is for the sake of eschatological survival. The story of the Council of Nicaea and the subsequent suppression of books like Enoch is often told as a story of human power, of political intrigue, and of the triumph of one theological faction over another. And while all of those elements are true, to stop there is to miss the most important part of the story. The ultimate lesson of this forbidden history is not about the power of emperors, but about the sovereignty of God. Constantine, in his imperial arrogance, may have believed that he could control the narrative, that he could shape Christianity into a tool that served his own ends. The bishops and councils that followed may have believed that by defining the canon and writing the creeds, they could build walls around divine truth, containing it within a safe and manageable system. They all believed that they were in control. But the return of the Book of Enoch in our time is a thunderous declaration that they were wrong. true revelation cannot be contained by human institutions. Divine truth cannot be voted into or out of existence by a council of men, no matter how powerful. God's story is not subject to the editorial approval of emperors or theologians. Constantine may have won the political battle of the 4th century. He successfully created a version of Christianity that served his empire, but he did not and could not win the war against the truth itself. The fact that we are even having this conversation today is a testament to this reality. The book that was banned, the history that was suppressed, the worldview that was declared heretical, it has survived. It survived not because of any human institution, but in spite of them. It was preserved in the margins, in the remote corners of the Christian world, and ultimately in the very dust of the earth, waiting for God's appointed time to be revealed again. This teaches us a profound and humbling lesson about where true authority lies. It does not lie in the councils, the creeds, or the canons that men construct. It lies in the unchangeable, untamable, and sovereign Word of God, which He reveals according to His own timetable, not ours. The story of Enoch's suppression and miraculous return is a powerful reminder that our faith should not be in the institutions that claim to preserve the truth, but in the God who is powerful enough to resurrect a truth even after it has been buried for nearly 2 millennia. And so we arrive at the threshold. The forbidden history has been laid bare. The motives behind the ancient act of censorship have been exposed. The suppressed worldview of the Book of Enoch, with its cosmic war, its fallen angels, and its multi-layered universe, is once again on the table for our consideration. And now the choice is no longer in the hands of Constantine or the Nicene Fathers. The choice passes to you. You now know what was in the book they banned. You have seen the complex, terrifying, and profoundly supernatural worldview that the empire and its church sought to bury. You have understood that the simplified version of Christianity that has dominated for centuries was a deliberate construction, a faith edited for political convenience and institutional control. And you are now faced with a decision that every generation, in its own way, must make. Will you choose to remain within the safe, familiar walls of the curated faith? It is a world of simple answers, of a manageable God, of a spiritual conflict that is largely metaphorical. It is a faith that demands little of you, but your assent to a creed that was written under imperial pressure. There is comfort in that world. There is stability. To remain there is to accept the verdict of the gatekeepers and to trust that their act of censorship was for your own good. Or will you choose to see? Will you choose to step outside those walls and embrace a far larger, far wilder, and far more demanding reality? Will you accept a universe that is teeming with spiritual conflict, a history that is saturated with supernatural events, and a faith that calls you not to be a civilian, but a soldier? To choose this path is to trust the testimony of the ancient silenced witnesses over the polished narratives of the victors of history. It is to declare that you are not afraid of a complex truth, and that you are ready to see the world as the apostles and the earliest believers saw it, a contested battlefield in a war that is still very, very real. The choice is yours. As we look back upon this forbidden history, from the secret councils of Nicaea to the suppressed chronicles of Enoch, a single unifying truth emerges. The greatest fear of Constantine and of the imperial system he sought to build was not a theological disagreement. It was not the Arian heresy. It was not the diversity of Christian belief. The empire's greatest fear was a universe it could not control. The Book of Enoch was the ultimate embodiment of that fear. It presented a universe with a government that superseded Rome, a king whose authority dwarfed that of any emperor, and a history that was not written by human victors but was preordained in the heavenly courts. It described a world where angels could mutiny, where humanity could be genetically contaminated, where the very fabric of creation was a battleground between vast and ancient supernatural forces. This was not a world that could be managed by imperial edicts or contained within the walls of a state-sponsored church. Constantine's greatest fear was a god who was too big, too wild, and too sovereign to be an ally of the state. He needed a god who could be defined, a creed that could be enforced, and an enemy that could be easily identified and defeated. The Book of Enoch gave him none of these things. It gave him a god of unsearchable complexity, a history of cosmic chaos, and an enemy so ancient and so powerful that it could not be defeated by Roman legions. The decision to ban the Book of Enoch was, therefore, not primarily an act of theological discernment. It was an act of political necessity. It was an attempt to shrink the cosmos down to a manageable size, to reduce the untamable God of Enoch to the more philosophical and predictable God of the Nicene Creed. The empire's greatest fear was a loss of control, and the Book of Enoch was, and still is, the ultimate declaration that control has always been an illusion. True power does not reside in earthly thrones, but in the one who presides over the 10 heavens, the Lord of Spirits. Today, the imperial ban has been lifted. Not by the decree of another council, not by the permission of any earthly institution, but by the quiet providence of God, who chose to preserve his truth in desert caves and remote monasteries, waiting for a time when the world would be ready to listen again. The Book of Enoch is no longer sealed in the tombs of history. It is before you now, its pages open, its testimony echoing across the centuries. The act of censorship at Nicaea was not, in the end, an act of protecting the faith. It was an act of self-protection. Constantine and the system he created were not afraid that the book would harm you. They were afraid that it would liberate you. Liberate you from a simplified faith. Liberate you from a human-centric view of sin. Liberate you from the illusion that any earthly power, no matter how pious it claims to be, holds the final authority on divine truth. The forbidden history of the Council of Nicaea is the story of how a religion of revelation was transformed into a religion of regulation. But the return of the Book of Enoch is a call to return to the source. It is an invitation to step out of the comfortable, well-lit basilica and back into the wild, terrifying and glorious cosmos of the early believers. It is a reminder that the war is real, the stakes are cosmic, and your role in it is far greater than you have ever been told. And so the final question is not one of history, but of your own future. Now that you know that the gatekeepers deliberately hid the true scale of the cosmic war, how does this change the way you see the role of faith in the world today? Let us know in the comments below.